For the first time in 80 years, European nations are preparing for the possibility of a major land war on their continent. Germany just announced its largest military buildup since World War II. Finland and Sweden abandoned decades of neutrality to join NATO. Poland is building an army larger than Britain, France, and Germany combined. And across the continent, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, countries that once saw war as a distant memory are now stockpiling ammunition, building bunkers, and teaching their citizens how to survive in conflict zones. Europe is transforming before our eyes, and the catalyst for this massive shift is the war in Ukraine. Right now, as you watch this video, the longest and most intense ground war Europe has seen since 1945 is still raging. Over 1,000 days of combat, hundreds of thousands of casualties, entire cities reduced to rubble. But the impact of this war extends far beyond Ukraine's borders. It's fundamentally reshaping the political, military, economic, and social fabric of the entire European continent. The Europe that existed before February 24, 2022, when Russian tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border, that Europe is gone. What's emerging in its place is something we haven't seen in generations, a continent remilitarizing, redefining its security, and confronting the reality that peace cannot be taken for granted. Stay with me for the next 20 minutes, because what I'm about to share will help you understand not just what's happening in Europe right now, but where we're all headed. This isn't just a regional conflict. The changes sweeping across Europe have implications for global security, the world economy, and the future of international relations. Understanding these transformations is essential to understanding the world your children and grandchildren will inherit. Let's start with the most visible and dramatic change, the complete overturning of Europe's post-Cold War security architecture. For 3 decades after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, most European nations operated under a set of assumptions that now seem almost naive. They assumed that major war in Europe was a thing of the past. They assumed that economic interdependence, particularly with Russia, would prevent conflict. They assumed that they could rely on the United States for defense, while spending minimal amounts on their own militaries. They assumed that soft power, diplomacy, and international institutions would be sufficient to manage security threats. Every single one of those assumptions has been shattered. When Russian forces invaded Ukraine on that cold February morning in 2022, with the goal of capturing Kiev within days and installing a puppet government, Europe woke up to a terrifying new reality. This wasn't some distant conflict in the Middle East or Africa. This was a major power using massive military force to conquer a European nation. And if Ukraine could be invaded, if its sovereignty could be violated so brazenly, then what about the Baltic states? What about Poland? What about Moldova? The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Imagine living your entire adult life believing that war in your region was impossible, only to watch it unfold on your television screen, just a few hundred miles from your border. For people in Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, Finland, the war in Ukraine isn't some abstract geopolitical event. It's personal and immediate. They can hear the echoes of artillery. They're hosting millions of refugees. They're staring at the possibility that they could be next. This fear has triggered the most dramatic military buildup in Europe since the 1980s. Let me give you some specific examples that illustrate just how massive this shift is. Germany, which for decades maintained a relatively small and underfunded military as part of its post-World War II identity, announced a special defense fund of 100 billion euros. That's on top of committing to spend over 2% of GDP on defense annually. Chancellor Olaf Scholz called it a Zeitenwende, a turning point. Germany is now developing plans for an army of 203,000 active personnel and procuring massive amounts of new equipment. Poland has gone even further. Poland is on track to have the largest and most powerful military in Europe outside of Russia. They're spending over 4% of GDP on defense, double the NATO target. They've ordered hundreds of advanced tanks from South Korea, dozens of F-35 fighter jets from the United States, and HIMARS rocket systems. They're building a military that's larger than the UK and France combined. Why? Because Poland has been invaded and partitioned so many times throughout history, and they're determined never to be vulnerable again. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are equally alarmed. These tiny nations on Russia's border gained independence only in 1991, after decades of Soviet occupation. They have significant Russian-speaking minorities, and they fear Putin could use the same playbook he used in Ukraine, claiming he needs to protect Russian speakers. All three Baltic states have dramatically increased defense spending and are building defensive fortifications along their borders with Russia. They're preparing for the possibility of Russian aggression with deadly seriousness. Then there's Finland and Sweden, and this might be the most symbolically significant change of all. Finland maintained armed neutrality for decades as a way to manage its relationship with its massive Russian neighbor. They stayed out of NATO, carefully balancing their Western alignment with the need not to provoke Moscow. Sweden had been neutral for over 200 years, staying out of both world wars. These policies were fundamental to these nations' identities. All of that ended because of Ukraine. When Finland and Sweden saw what Russia was willing to do to Ukraine, they concluded that neutrality was no longer viable. In 2023 and 2024, both nations joined NATO, adding 1,300 kilometers of NATO border with Russia and bringing two highly capable militaries into the alliance. Putin wanted to prevent NATO expansion. His invasion of Ukraine triggered the biggest NATO expansion in decades. It's a strategic catastrophe for Russia and a fundamental reshaping of Northern European security. But it's not just about military spending and alliances. The war in Ukraine has forced Europe to confront its energy dependency on Russia, and this has triggered an energy transformation that's both painful and profound. Before the war, Europe, particularly Germany, was deeply dependent on Russian natural gas. Over 40% of the EU's gas imports came from Russia. The logic was clear: cheap Russian energy would fuel European industry, and economic interdependence would prevent conflict. Germany even built Nord Stream 2, a massive pipeline directly from Russia, despite warnings from the US and Eastern European allies. The war exposed the catastrophic vulnerability this created. Russia weaponized energy, cutting off gas supplies to countries that supported Ukraine, causing energy prices to skyrocket across Europe. In the winter of 2022, Europeans faced the real possibility of blackouts and unaffordable heating bills. Factories shut down because of energy costs. The economic pain was severe. But Europe responded with remarkable speed and determination. In less than 2 years, Europe has fundamentally restructured its energy supply. Germany has built multiple LNG terminals to import liquefied natural gas from the United States, Qatar, and other sources. European countries have dramatically increased renewable energy installations. They've negotiated new supply agreements with Norway, Algeria, and other producers. The share of Russian gas in European imports has dropped from over 40% to under 10%. This is an extraordinary achievement that few thought possible so quickly. But this energy transition comes at enormous cost. European industries that were built on cheap Russian gas are struggling to compete. Energy prices remain significantly higher than before the war, affecting everything from electricity bills to industrial production costs. The economic strain has contributed to inflation, cost of living crises, and political instability across the continent. The war in Ukraine isn't just changing Europe's military posture. It's fundamentally altering its economic model. Let's talk about the humanitarian dimension, because the refugee crisis triggered by this war is the largest Europe has seen since World War II. Over 6 million Ukrainians have fled to other European countries. Poland alone has hosted over 3 million Ukrainian refugees at various points. Germany, Czech Republic, Moldova, Romania, and many other nations have opened their doors. This is an unprecedented act of solidarity, but it's also an enormous challenge. Unlike the 2015 refugee crisis from Syria and the Middle East, which triggered significant political backlash and the rise of far-right parties, the Ukrainian refugee response has been remarkably welcoming. Why? Several factors explain this. Ukrainians are European, predominantly Christian, and seen as fleeing an aggressor that threatens all of Europe. Many European countries have historical, cultural, and linguistic ties to Ukraine. And perhaps most importantly, European nations see Ukrainian refugees as people who want to return home once the war ends, not permanent immigrants. This welcoming attitude has important implications. Schools across Europe have absorbed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children. Healthcare systems are treating Ukrainian patients. Labor markets have integrated Ukrainian workers. European society has demonstrated a capacity for solidarity and humanitarian response that had seemed questionable after the divisive debates of the 2015 crisis. But this generosity is not unlimited, and as the war drags on, questions about long-term integration and support are becoming more pressing. The war has also dramatically shifted European public opinion on defense and security. For decades, particularly in Western Europe, there was a strong pacifist sentiment. Defense spending was seen as wasteful, military solutions as primitive, and the idea of war in Europe as absurd. Young Europeans, especially in Germany, Netherlands, and Scandinavia, grew up in a culture that emphasized peace, diplomacy, and multilateralism above all else. Military service was often avoided, and defense issues barely registered in political debates. That's changing rapidly. Opinion polls across Europe now show majorities supporting increased defense spending. Young people are joining militaries in increased numbers. Political parties that were once dovish are now competing to show they're tough on defense. The Greens in Germany, historically pacifist, voted to send weapons to Ukraine, a position unthinkable just a few years ago. The war has forced a generational reckoning with the reality that sometimes force is necessary to defend freedom and sovereignty. But this shift in public opinion isn't uniform across Europe. There are significant divisions, and these divisions reveal deeper fault lines in European politics. Western European nations, particularly Germany and France, have been more cautious about providing military aid to Ukraine and more interested in negotiations with Russia. Eastern European nations, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, have been far more hawkish, arguing that Russia must be defeated militarily, and that compromise is both dangerous and immoral. These divisions reflect different historical experiences and geographic realities. Eastern European nations that were occupied by the Soviet Union or dominated by Russia for centuries see this as an existential struggle. They know from bitter experience that appeasing Russia doesn't work. Western European nations, more distant from the front lines and with different historical relationships with Russia, are more concerned about economic costs and escalation risks. Managing these divisions while maintaining European unity is one of the great challenges of this moment. The war has also accelerated Europe's defense industrial mobilization, and this is perhaps one of the most significant long-term changes. For decades, European defense industries atrophied. After the Cold War ended, there seemed to be no need for mass production of weapons. Factories closed, supply chains disappeared, expertise was lost. Europe became dependent on imports and small-scale production. When the war in Ukraine began, this neglect became starkly apparent. Ukraine is consuming ammunition and weapons at rates that far exceed European production capacity. Artillery shells, the most basic weapon of this war, became desperately scarce. European nations were sending Ukraine their stockpiles, but those stockpiles were small, and production couldn't keep pace. At the height of the ammunition crisis, Russia was producing roughly 3 million artillery shells per year, while all of Europe combined was producing less than 500,000. This was a strategic disaster. Europe is now frantically rebuilding its defense industrial base. Governments are signing multi-year contracts to give manufacturers the certainty needed for investment. New production lines are being built. Old factories are being reopened. Supply chains are being reconstituted. The goal is to produce millions of artillery shells annually, along with missiles, drones, armored vehicles, and all the other equipment modern war requires. This isn't just about supporting Ukraine. It's about ensuring that European nations could sustain their own defense in a conflict. This industrial mobilization has economic implications beyond defense. It's creating jobs, driving technological innovation, and reshaping supply chains. But it's also diverting resources from other priorities and raising questions about the militarization of European societies. Are we entering a new arms race? Is Europe heading back toward the militarized Cold War posture? These are questions Europeans are grappling with in real time. Let's talk about the political consequences of this war, because it's reshaping European politics in ways that will affect the continent for decades. In some countries, the war has strengthened pro-European, pro-democracy forces. In others, it's empowered nationalist and populist movements. The political landscape is shifting, and the outcomes are far from certain. In countries on the front lines, Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, there's been political consensus around supporting Ukraine and strengthening defense. These nations have seen a rally around the flag effect. In Western Europe, the picture is more complex. In Germany, the war triggered a political earthquake. The Social Democrats, Greens, and Free Democrats formed a coalition that had to abandon decades of foreign policy orthodoxy. Defense spending, arms exports, confrontation with Russia, all the things German politics had avoided, suddenly became unavoidable. In France, President Macron has positioned himself as a potential mediator, seeking to maintain dialogue with Putin while also supporting Ukraine. This has led to tensions with Eastern European allies who see any engagement with Putin as appeasement. Macron's vision of strategic autonomy for Europe, reducing dependence on the United States, has been challenged by the reality that European security still fundamentally depends on American military power. The United Kingdom, post-Brexit and searching for a new role, has positioned itself as one of Ukraine's strongest supporters. Britain has provided substantial military aid, trained Ukrainian troops, and taken a hard line against Russia. This has allowed the UK to rebuild some of its credibility and influence in Europe after the Brexit debacle. The war has given Britain a cause and a role. But in some countries, the war is empowering far-right and pro-Russian political movements. In Hungary, Viktor Orban has maintained close ties with Putin, blocked EU sanctions, and resisted aid to Ukraine. In Slovakia, the new government is pro-Russian and has stopped military aid to Ukraine. In Italy, the far-right government of Giorgia Meloni has been more pro-Ukraine than expected, but there are strong pro-Russian elements in Italian politics. In France, Marine Le Pen's National Rally, which has historical ties to Russia, remains a powerful force. These divisions create real challenges for European unity. The EU requires unanimity for many decisions, and a single country like Hungary can block or delay crucial measures. As the war drags on, as economic costs mount, and as war fatigue sets in, maintaining European consensus becomes harder. Russia is actively trying to exploit these divisions through disinformation, energy manipulation, and support for sympathetic political movements. The war has also changed Europe's relationship with the United States, and this is a critical dimension that often gets overlooked. During the Trump administration, there was serious doubt about American commitment to European security. Trump openly questioned NATO's value and suggested he might not defend NATO allies if they were attacked. This created panic in European capitals and sparked debates about European strategic autonomy. When the Ukraine war began, it was Biden, not Trump, in the White House. Biden's administration has been strongly supportive of Ukraine and has reinforced the U.S. commitment to NATO. American intelligence, weapons, training, and financial support have been crucial to Ukraine's resistance. The United States has provided over $75 billion in aid to Ukraine, far more than all European nations combined. This has reaffirmed American leadership of the Western Alliance. But it's also revealed European dependency. Europe cannot defend itself without the United States. European military capabilities, defense industries, intelligence systems, all are insufficient to counter a major threat like Russia without American support. This dependency is uncomfortable for many Europeans who aspire to strategic autonomy and global influence independent of Washington. The question of what happens if Trump or another isolationist president returns to power haunts European strategic planning. If America pulled back its security umbrella, could Europe defend itself? The honest answer right now is no. This is driving the military buildup and the push for European defense integration. But achieving genuine strategic autonomy would require decades and trillions of euros in investment. It's not clear Europe has the will or the resources for that. Let me talk about the technology and warfare lessons Europe is learning from Ukraine, because this war is the most significant proving ground for military technology since World War II. The Ukraine war is a laboratory, and the lessons being learned are transforming how European militaries think about future conflict. Drones have emerged as absolutely central to modern warfare. Both sides are using vast numbers of small commercial drones for reconnaissance and attack. These cheap drones, costing hundreds or thousands of dollars, are destroying tanks worth millions. European militaries, which had mostly ignored small drones, are now scrambling to develop counter-drone technologies and integrate drones into their own forces. The lesson is clear: future wars will be fought by swarms of drones, and militaries must adapt or become obsolete. Electronic warfare and cyber operations have proven crucial. Russia has used sophisticated jamming to disrupt Ukrainian communications, and GPS Ukraine has conducted remarkably effective cyber operations against Russian infrastructure. European nations are now prioritizing electronic warfare capabilities and cyber defense in ways they never did before. The electromagnetic spectrum is a battlefield. Long-range precision strikes have been decisive. Ukraine's use of systems like HIMARS to strike Russian logistics, command posts, and ammunition depots deep behind the front lines has been devastatingly effective. European militaries are now acquiring similar systems and thinking about how to defend against them. The ability to strike hundreds of kilometers behind enemy lines is essential. But perhaps the most important lesson is the endurance required for sustained high-intensity conflict. Modern wars, it turns out, still require massive amounts of artillery shells, tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry. All the talk about precision weapons and quick victories has run into the reality of grinding attritional warfare. European militaries must be able to sustain operations for months or years, not just weeks. This requires stockpiles, production capacity, and mobilization plans that don't currently exist. These lessons are driving major changes in European military doctrine, procurement, and training. The comfortable assumptions of the post-Cold War era, that wars would be quick, small-scale, and dominated by technology, have been replaced by the grim reality that major wars are long, brutal, and consume resources at staggering rates. As we approach the end of this video, let me address the fundamental question: what kind of Europe is emerging from this war? The answer is complex and still being written. In some ways, Europe is becoming more united. The threat from Russia has created a level of strategic consensus and cooperation that didn't exist before. Countries that once had deep divisions are working together more closely than ever on defense and security. But in other ways, Europe is becoming more divided. The gap between Eastern and Western Europe on Russia policy is significant. Economic strain is creating political instability. The rise of far-right and populist movements threatens liberal democracy in several countries. The challenge of maintaining unity, while respecting diverse interests and perspectives, is immense. Europe is also becoming more militarized and more focused on hard power. The era of soft power idealism is over. Military strength, defense production, and deterrence are back at the center of European strategic thinking. This is a profound cultural shift for a continent that spent decades trying to move beyond militarism. Europe is becoming more energy independent, but at significant economic cost. The break with Russia is probably permanent, ending any possibility of the kind of economic integration that many hoped would tie the continent together in peace. Europe's economic model, built on cheap Russian energy and global free trade, is being fundamentally restructured. And perhaps most importantly, Europe is being forced to grow up in security terms. For 75 years, since the end of World War II, European security has ultimately been guaranteed by the United States. That may not be sustainable or reliable going forward. Europe is being forced to take responsibility for its own defense, and that process is painful, expensive, and politically difficult. The war in Ukraine is the catalyst, but the changes it's triggering will shape Europe for decades to come. The children growing up in Europe today are growing up in a fundamentally different security environment than their parents did. They're growing up knowing that war is possible, that threats are real, and that peace must be actively defended, not passively assumed. So where does this leave us? The war in Ukraine has destroyed the illusion of permanent peace in Europe. It's forced a continent to confront uncomfortable truths about power, security, and the limits of diplomacy. It's triggered the most significant strategic realignment in Europe since the end of the Cold War. And it's reminded us all that history is not over, that conflict is still possible, and that the choices we make today will determine what kind of world we leave to future generations. Thank you for watching, and for taking the time to understand these profound changes. The war in Ukraine matters far beyond Ukraine. It's reshaping Europe, testing the Western alliance, and redefining what security means in the 21st century. Stay informed, stay engaged, and understand that these are not distant events. They're shaping the world we all live in, right now, today. The future of Europe, and perhaps the future of the international order, hangs in the balance. And we all have a stake in how this story unfolds.